Burke County, Georgia, kept a secret so disturbing that for 3 generations, people refused to speak of it openly. At Willow Bend Plantation, between March 1838 and September 1839, 17 people died under mysterious circumstances, and not one death certificate listed the true cause. Their local physicians burned records. From the official register, the county clerk erased entire pages. When investigators from Savannah finally arrived in October 1839, they found a community united in silence, protecting something far worse than any crime they could imagine. Everything the antebellum South claimed about civilization, medicine, and the lengths one woman would go to protect a lie that could destroy an entire family legacy would be challenged by what they discovered in a sealed root cellar beneath the main house. Before we continue with the story of Cordelia Rutledge and the ritual that consumed Willow Bend Plantation, we invite you to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Leave a comment telling us which state or city you are listening from. Bringing more forgotten American mysteries to light is something your support helps us do. The truth began with a death that nobody questioned because in Georgia of 1838, wealthy men dying suddenly was common enough. Across the fertile Savannah River Valley stretched Burke County, where cotton grew so thick that plantation owners measured their wealth not in dollars, but in bales per acre. By 1838, the county had become one of the wealthiest regions in Georgia. With over 60 major plantations producing cotton that fed the mills of Manchester and Liverpool, the county seat was the town of Waynesboro, a prosperous community of 3,000 souls where Episcopal churches stood on every corner and social hierarchy was as rigid as iron. About 7 miles southeast of Waynesboro, Willow Bend Plantation occupied 1,400 acres of prime bottomland along Turkey Creek. In the federal style, the main house rose 3 stories high, with columns that gleamed white against red brick. The cotton fields were worked by 42 enslaved people, while another 18 served in the house, stables, and workshops. Since 1792, the plantation had belonged to the Rutledge family, passed down through 3 generations of prosperous planters who prided themselves on their English ancestry and refined manners. To Willow Bend in 1820 came Cordelia Vance Rutledge as a bride of 19, married to Thomas Rutledge, then 34 and already a widower. From Charleston she came, the daughter of a shipping merchant whose fortunes had declined after the embargo years. On both sides, the marriage was strategic. A wife to manage his household and provide heirs was what Thomas needed, while the security of plantation wealth was what Cordelia's family needed. For a woman of her time, she was tall, standing 5 feet 8 inches, with dark auburn hair and pale gray eyes that, servants whispered, could see through walls. Over 18 years of marriage, 5 children were born by Cordelia to Thomas, Margaret in 1821, Thomas Jr. in 1823, Catherine in 1825, Edmund in 1828, and finally Elizabeth in 1831. In Burke County society, the Rutledge family occupied a position of considerable influence. A county commissioner was Thomas, and he owned shares in the Waynesboro Bank. Elaborate dinner parties were hosted by Cordelia, and she was known for her French cooking and precisely managed household. Cold but capable was how neighbors considered her, a woman who ran Willow Bend with the efficiency of a military quartermaster. But those who knew her best noticed something else. Extensive journals were kept by Cordelia, writing by candlelight long after the household slept. From Philadelphia and Charleston, she read medical texts she ordered, unusual for a plantation wife whose education should have focused on household management and music. About the mistress who walked the fields at dawn, examining workers with the intensity of a livestock appraiser, the plantation's enslaved community whispered, asking strange questions about their family histories and physical constitutions. Of his era, Thomas Rutledge appeared to be a typical planter, stern but not exceptionally cruel, focused on profit margins and maintaining social standing. Most evenings he drank whiskey, smoked cigars on the veranda, and discussed politics with visiting neighbors. Every Sunday he attended the Presbyterian Church in Waynesboro, occupying the Rutledge family pew with his wife and children arranged in order of age. Yet there were irregularities that few outside the family knew about. After 1832, Thomas kept a separate bedroom from Cordelia, claiming her nighttime writing disturbed his sleep. For several years he had suffered from recurring digestive complaints, treated by Dr. Silas Pemberton from Waynesboro with calomel and laudanum. Through 1837 the complaints worsened, though Dr. Pemberton found nothing particularly alarming in his examinations. At Willow Bend, the enslaved population included 3 men who held unusual positions in the plantation hierarchy. As the head carpenter worked Isaiah Drummond, age 32, responsible for maintaining all structures on the property. From Virginia, his father had been a skilled craftsman, and Isaiah inherited both the talent and the privileged position that came with essential skills. Having been taught to read by Thomas's father in the 1810s, he was literate so he could follow building plans and order supplies. As the plantation's blacksmith and metal worker served Caleb Tucker, 28. From a failed plantation in South Carolina in 1829, he had been purchased specifically for his smithing skills. Powerfully built was Caleb, standing over 6 feet tall, and known for his quiet intensity and complete focus on his work. Unlike most enslaved workers, he lived in a separate cabin near the forge rather than in the quarters with the field hands. The third man was Josiah Mercer, 26, who worked as Thomas Rutledge's personal body servant and occasionally as a driver supervising field work. At Willow Bend, Josiah had grown up, born to a house servant named Ruth, who had died of consumption in 1824. An unusual interest in the boy's education had been taken by Thomas, having him trained in various skills, including reading, arithmetic, and the management of other workers. Certain physical characteristics were shared by all 3 men. They were tall, well-built, lighter-skinned than most of the plantation's enslaved population, and possessed skills that elevated them above field labor. Small privileges had been granted to all 3, such as keeping a portion of money earned from hiring out their skills to neighboring plantations, and the same peculiar birthmark was borne by all 3, a crescent-shaped discoloration on their left shoulder blade, though this detail would not become significant until much later. The rhythms common to cotton plantations in the Georgia lowlands were what life at Willow Bend followed. In March began spring planting. In September the cotton bolls opened, and October and November were consumed by harvest. Before dawn, the enslaved population rose and worked until darkness with brief breaks for meals. With exacting precision, Cordelia managed the household staff, maintaining inventories of every sheet, spoon, and candle. Personally, she supervised the kitchen, the dairy, the smokehouse, and the weaving house, where cloth was produced for the plantation's use. Riding the fields, meeting with his overseer, and handling the business correspondence that connected Willow Bend to cotton factors in Savannah was how Thomas spent his days. For business meetings and social engagements, he traveled to Waynesboro twice a week. In the formal dining room, the family gathered for supper in the evenings, where Cordelia enforced strict rules about conversation, posture, and etiquette. But beneath this surface of plantation normalcy, something else was growing. From 1836 and 1837, Cordelia's journals, later discovered and partially destroyed, contained increasingly strange observations about bloodlines, inheritance, and what she called the persistence of traits across generations. With someone in Charleston, she had been corresponding, letters that arrived in plain envelopes without return addresses. Through a connection in Augusta, she had also been purchasing unusual medical supplies, including mercury compounds, arsenic preparations, and equipment for what she described in her accounts as hydrotherapeutic treatments. Particularly harsh in Burke County was the winter of 1837 to 1838. For days at a stretch, temperatures dropped below freezing, unusual for the Georgia lowlands. At its edges, the Savannah River froze. In their cabins, enslaved people huddled, burning whatever fuel they could gather. In the main house, fireplaces roared constantly, and even indoors, the family wore layers of wool. That winter, Thomas's health declined sharply. Severe cramping became his digestive complaints. Rapidly he lost weight, his face taking on a gray, waxy appearance. Weekly Dr. Pemberton visited, prescribing various remedies that seemed to provide no relief. Personally, Cordelia prepared all of Thomas's meals, bringing trays to his bedroom and feeding him broths and tonics of her own making. On the morning of March 3, 1838, by Josiah Mercer was Thomas Rutledge found dead in his bed, who had arrived to help the master dress for the day. 52 years old was Thomas. Immediately summoned, Dr. Pemberton examined the body and declared the cause of death to be acute gastric fever with complications of the liver. He noted that Thomas had been declining for months and that such deaths were regrettably common among men of his age and habits. With remarkable composure, Cordelia received the news. She did not weep or cry out. Instead, with methodical precision, she immediately began organizing the funeral arrangements. She selected Thomas's burial clothes, drafted the death notice for the Waynesboro newspaper, and sent word to relatives in Charleston and Savannah. She ordered the plantation's enslaved workers to drape the main house in black crepe and prepare the parlor for the viewing. 3 days later, Thomas Rutledge was buried in the family cemetery at Willow Bend, a small plot surrounded by an iron fence where his parents and his first wife already rested. By most of Burke County's prominent families, the funeral was attended. From the Presbyterian Church, Reverend Nathaniel Crawford delivered a sermon about earthly rewards and heavenly rest. Dressed entirely in black silk, Cordelia stood at graveside, her face hidden behind a heavy veil, her gloved hands folded calmly at her waist. What no one knew was that the morning after Thomas's death, before the body was even cold, to the root cellar beneath the kitchen house had gone Cordelia. There she retrieved a locked wooden box she had hidden among the stored vegetables. Inside were letters, medical receipts, and a small journal bound in black leather. By lamplight, she spent an hour reading through these documents, her face expressionless. Then to the box she returned them and hid it in a new location beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom closet. The day after the funeral, to the main house Cordelia summoned Isaiah Drummond, Caleb Tucker, and Josiah Mercer. In Thomas's former study she met them, sitting behind his massive mahogany desk. She told them that new duties would be taken on by them, duties that would require absolute discretion and obedience. By a European physician specialist in a new medical treatment that would preserve her health and allow her to continue managing the plantation effectively, she explained that she had been instructed. Assistants required the treatment, and for this purpose, they had been selected. In the matter, none of the 3 men had any choice. As completely as she owned the furniture in the room, Cordelia owned them. As she described what would be expected of them, they listened, and though the instructions were strange and disturbing, they understood that refusal was impossible. As she spoke, Cordelia's gray eyes remained fixed on each man, and something in that gaze suggested far more than simple authority. Dark and specific knowledge was there, that seemed to pin each man in place. The following morning at Turkey Creek would the ritual begin. Through the southern portion of Willow Bend Plantation wound Turkey Creek, a clear stream about 20 feet wide that flowed year-round, even in drought. Spring-fed was the creek, and its water remained cold even in summer. Along its banks grew cypress trees, their roots creating natural seats and steps down to the water. For washing clothes on designated days, the enslaved population used the creek, but generally it remained quiet and isolated, hidden from the main house by a grove of live oaks and thick undergrowth. On the morning of March 7, 1838, 4 days after Thomas Rutledge's funeral, at first light Cordelia walked to Turkey Creek. A simple gray dress she wore with none of the morning finery she displayed publicly, and she carried a bundle wrapped in linen. At a distance, she was followed by Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah, who had been instructed to arrive separately so as not to draw attention. Cold and damp was the morning, with fog rising from the creek surface. Of wet earth and decaying leaves, the air smelled. From the trees birds called, and somewhere in the distance at the plantation house, a hound barked. The world was just waking up, and in that liminal hour between night and day, outside of normal time the creek seemed to exist. At a particular bend in the creek Cordelia stopped, where a large flat rock jutted into the water, creating a natural platform. She set down her bundle and turned to face the 3 men who stood uncertainly on the bank. When she spoke, her voice was calm and matter-of-fact, as though she were giving instructions for building a fence or slaughtering a hog. Together, she explained, they would all enter the water. Her clothing she would remove, and they would do the same. In a circle in the waist-deep water they would stand, and certain ablutions on each of them and on herself she would perform. Throughout the process, they would remain silent. About these sessions, which would occur every morning at dawn, they would tell no one. Immediately would be sold any man who spoke of what happened at the creek to the worst slave trader she could find, sent to the sugar plantations in Louisiana, where men died within 5 years. But beyond the threat, something else was in her voice, a certainty, a knowing. At each man she looked and said their names in a particular way, a way that suggested she knew things about them that no one else knew. Things about their fathers, things about their blood. Into the water, Isaiah was the first to step, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the far bank. Caleb followed, his massive shoulders rigid with tension. Josiah came last, and those who later heard his account said he looked like a man walking to his own hanging. Without hesitation or modesty, Cordelia removed her dress. Nothing beneath it she wore. In the early morning light, her body was pale, marked with the faint stretch marks of 5 pregnancies. Into the cold water she stepped without flinching, moving to the center where the current ran strongest. A triangle around her facing outward she instructed the 3 men to form. What happened next would be described years later in testimony that some claimed was exaggerated by trauma and others insisted was precise truth. From her bundle, Cordelia produced a collection of items, a razor, several glass bottles containing clear liquids, pieces of cloth, and a small leather-bound book. She opened the book and read aloud in a language none of the men recognized, something that sounded like Latin, but wasn't quite. She then proceeded to wash each man with water drawn from the creek in a specific pattern: shoulders, chest, arms, back, legs. One of the liquids from her bottles she used, which burned slightly on the skin and smelled of chemicals and herbs. As she worked, she recited phrases, her voice steady and rhythmic. Rigid stood the men, staring at the trees, the sky, anywhere but at her or at each other. When she finished with the 3 men, on herself she performed the same washing ritual, her movements precise and methodical. Then the razor she produced and made small cuts on each man's left shoulder directly over the crescent-shaped birthmarks. Shallow but deliberate were the cuts, and the blood that welled up she collected on pieces of white cloth. This blood she mixed with more liquid from her bottles and then applied the mixture to her own chest and abdomen, rubbing it into her skin while continuing to recite from the book. Perhaps 30 minutes took the entire process. When it was finished, Cordelia instructed the men to dress and return to their normal duties. Tomorrow at the same time, she told them to come back. Herself she dressed, wrapped her items back in the linen bundle, and walked back toward the main house without looking back. For several minutes after she left, on the creek bank stood Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah, unable to speak or even look at each other. Finally, without a word, to begin the day's work they went their separate ways. But something had changed. Each man felt it. A heaviness in his chest, a confusion in his thoughts. As though something had been taken from them and something else left in its place. The following morning was the ritual repeated, and the morning after that, and every morning thereafter. Sometimes Cordelia varied the procedure slightly, using different liquids, cutting in different places, reciting different passages from her book, but the essential elements remained the same: the dawn hour, the cold water, the nakedness, the washing, the blood, and the words. Within 2 weeks, at Willow Bend people began to notice changes in Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah. The 3 men, who had previously been among the most capable and alert workers on the plantation, began to move as though in a fog. Adequately they performed their tasks, but without the initiative or skill that had distinguished them. A distant, glazed quality took on their eyes. Little they spoke even to each other, communicating in brief, flat sentences when necessary. Rachel, one of the house servants who had known Josiah since childhood, later testified that it was like watching a man slowly disappear from inside his own body. He still looked like Josiah, still walked and talked like him, but the essential spark that made him who he was seemed to be draining away day by day. She tried asking him what was wrong, but he just stared at her as though he didn't quite recognize her, then turned and walked away without answering. The other enslaved people noticed, too. In the quarters at night, whispers began. The three men were being worked with roots, conjured, hexed. From somewhere, perhaps from New Orleans where such things were known, dark magic had been learned by Mistress Cordelia. Slowly the men were being poisoned, their minds stolen, but no one dared speak openly about it, and certainly no one dared confront Cordelia herself. In the main house, Cordelia's children noticed their mother's strange new routine. Before dawn every day she rose, regardless of weather, and for about an hour was gone. When she returned, her hair was often damp, and immediately to her room she would go to change clothes. When young Edmund, then 10 years old, asked where she went, she told him she was taking morning constitutionals for her health, walking by the creek. Not to follow her she advised him, as the early morning air was dangerous for children with weak constitutions. More suspicious was Margaret, the eldest daughter at 17. Perceptive she had always been, and she noticed not only her mother's absences, but also the changes in Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah. That her mother kept the black leather book with her at all times now she noticed, even sleeping with it under her pillow. That her mother had lost weight despite eating normally she noticed, and that there was a feverish energy about her, a brightness in her eyes that seemed unnatural. One morning in early April, to the creek Margaret tried to follow her mother. Quietly she dressed and slipped out of the house just as Cordelia disappeared into the oak grove, but Cordelia seemed to have anticipated this. Just inside the tree line she was waiting, her face cold with fury. Hard enough to leave bruises she grabbed Margaret's wrist and told her daughter in a voice barely above a whisper that if she ever followed again, if she ever spoke to anyone about her mother's morning walks, to it Cordelia would see that Margaret never married, never left Willowban, never had anything approaching a life of her own. Frightened by the intensity in her mother's eyes, Margaret fled back to the house. That night, in her own diary Margaret wrote, a leather journal she kept hidden in her wardrobe. That her mother had become something she no longer recognized she wrote. That from her there was a wrongness emanating, like a smell. That whatever was happening at the creek was evil, though Margaret had no clear understanding of what evil meant beyond what she had learned in church. If she should tell someone she wondered. But who? Her father was dead. Reverend Crawford. What would she even say? To watch and wait Margaret decided. More carefully she began observing her mother, noting small details, the chemical smell that sometimes clung to Cordelia's clothes, the way she would stare at Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah during the day, studying them like specimens, the locked box that appeared in her mother's room, a box that hadn't been there before her father's death. Meanwhile, in earnest the spring planting season had begun. Constant attention required the fields. With her usual efficiency, Cordelia supervised the work, meeting with the overseer, checking the accounts, ensuring that every task was completed properly. To the outside world, exactly what a plantation widow should be she was, capable, composed, managing her late husband's estate until her eldest son came of age to take over. But at night, alone in her room, by candlelight Cordelia wrote in her journals. About the three men's deteriorating conditions she recorded observations, she noted changes in their vitals, their responsiveness, their physical capabilities. About dosages and frequencies she wrote. From medical texts and correspondence with someone she referred to only as Dr. H, she referenced passages. About her own physical sensations she wrote, changes she believed were occurring in her body, improvements in her health that she attributed to the treatments, and about her late husband, Thomas, she wrote, though these entries were cryptic and bitter. About lies and discoveries and betrayals she wrote. About bloodlines and inheritances she wrote. About the need to correct what had been corrupted, to purify what had been tainted she wrote. In these passages, her handwriting became increasingly erratic, the letters slashing across the page with violent energy. If this disturbing ritual was giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in the nightmare that consumed Willowben Plantation. By May 1838, impossible to ignore had the changes in Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah become. Significant weight had been lost by all three men. Slow and uncoordinated had their movements become. Isaiah, who had been capable of building complex structures from memory, for even simple repairs now needed written instructions. Sloppy and imprecise became Caleb's metal work. Instructions given to him an hour earlier could Josiah barely remember. When he visited Willowben in late May to check on the family's health, Dr. Silas Pemberton noticed the deterioration. 63 years old was the doctor, a graduate of the Medical College of Georgia in Augusta, and practicing in Burke County for over 30 years. A small, neat man with precise movements he was, and a reputation for thoroughness, though his medical knowledge was limited to what had been taught in the 1790s and what he had learned through decades of trial and error. To examine young Elizabeth, who had developed a persistent cough, Cordelia had invited Dr. Pemberton. While treating the child, the doctor happened to see Josiah Mercer carrying firewood to the house. By the man's gaunt appearance and trembling hands he was struck. Later, while leaving, he encountered Isaiah attempting to repair a shutter and noticed the same disturbing symptoms: weight loss, tremors, and a peculiar vacant expression. His observations Dr. Pemberton mentioned to Cordelia, asking if there had been illness among the workers. That the three men had been suffering from a recurring ague common in the lowlands Cordelia explained, something she had been treating with quinine and calomel. This explanation the doctor accepted, as malaria was indeed endemic to the region and often caused such symptoms. To examine the men more closely he offered, but Cordelia declined, saying she had the situation well in hand. However, troubled enough was Dr. Pemberton to mention what he had seen to his colleague, Dr. Francis Calloway, during a meeting of the Burke County Medical Society in Waynesboro later that week. Over brandy, the two physicians discussed the symptoms, trying to determine if there was some new fever spreading through the enslaved population. That perhaps the men had been exposed to contaminated water or spoiled food, Dr. Calloway suggested. Possible this was Dr. Pemberton agreed, but noted that no other workers at Willowben seemed affected. There the conversation would have ended, forgotten among the countless medical discussions that occupied physicians' time, except for one detail. That Mistress Rutledge had claimed to be treating the men with quinine and calomel Dr. Pemberton mentioned, but he had not observed the characteristic blue-gray discoloration of the gums and tongue that calomel typically produced when used regularly. In his mind, this discrepancy lodged like a splinter. In early June, something happened that brought the situation at Willowben to wider attention. While working on repairs to the plantation's cotton gin, Isaiah Drummond collapsed. Simply he fell forward, unconscious, and for several minutes could not be revived. When he came to, he could not remember where he was or what he had been doing. Slurred was his speech, and one side of his face seemed to droop slightly. To Cordelia, the overseer, a man named Marcus de Quincy, reported the incident. In the carpenter's cabin where he had been taken to rest, Cordelia visited Isaiah. Briefly she examined him, then ordered that he be kept in his cabin and given only water and bread until he recovered. The man had been drinking, she said, though Marcus knew for certain that Isaiah never touched alcohol, and there was no whiskey smell about him. 2 days later, at the forge suffered Caleb Tucker a similar collapse. He had been working iron when his legs simply gave out beneath him. On the ground, other workers found him lying, semi-conscious, muttering incoherently. Like Isaiah, slowly he recovered and could not explain what had happened. The same was Cordelia's response: isolation and minimal food. Now deeply frightened was the enslaved community. 2 of their strongest men who had never been sick a day in their lives, were wasting away before their eyes. More insistent became the whispers. Slowly, Mistress Cordelia was killing them. Poison she was feeding them, or working roots on them. About people who could steal souls, who could turn strong men into hollow shells, some remembered old stories from Africa and the Caribbean. An elderly woman named Dinah, who had been brought from the Congo decades earlier and was respected for her knowledge of herbs and healing, one evening in mid-June approached Josiah Mercer. To tell her what was being done to him and the others she begged him. With those empty eyes, Josiah stared at her and said nothing. A protective charm into his hand Dinah tried pressing, a small bag of roots and stones, but Josiah let it fall to the ground and walked away. To the overseer Marcus de Quincey went Dinah, a rare step for an enslaved person to take as it risked severe punishment. That the mistress was doing something evil to the three men she told him, that she was draining their life force at the creek every morning. As superstitious nonsense, Marcus dismissed her claims and threatened to have her whipped if she spread such wild stories. But privately, beginning to have his own doubts about what was happening at Willowbend was Marcus. 35 years old was Marcus de Quincey, born in Louisiana to French-speaking parents, and had worked as an overseer on various plantations throughout Georgia and South Carolina. A kind man he was not, his profession did not allow for kindness, but observant and practical he was. On routine and order plantations operated he knew, and what was happening at Willowbend was disruptive to both. Cordelia's dawn absences he had noticed. The three men's deterioration he had noticed. That the mistress seemed to be thriving in a way that was unusual for a recent widow he had also noticed. More energy she had, seemed younger somehow, moved with a vitality that contradicted her 43 years. As though whatever was draining from the three men was flowing into her. His own observations Marcus began making. Early he started rising, positioning himself where he could see the path to Turkey Creek. Each morning he watched Cordelia walk that path, followed separately by Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah. Close enough to see what actually happened at the creek he never went. Something instinctive told him that would be dangerous, but the timing, the frequency, the absolute regularity of the ritual he noted. For information about Cordelia's background he also began searching. Casually with the house servants he spoke, asking about the mistress's habits, her interests, her correspondence. That she received letters from Charleston regularly he learned, letters that arrived in unmarked envelopes. That she had been purchasing unusual supplies from Augusta through a connection at an apothecary shop he learned. That before her marriage to Thomas Rutledge, Cordelia had spent 2 years at a girls' academy in Philadelphia he learned, unusual for a Southern woman of her generation. By late June, enough concerning details had Marcus accumulated that he considered going to the county authorities. But what exactly would he report? That a plantation mistress was taking morning walks with 3 of her slaves, that those slaves had developed mysterious health problems, that the enslaved community believed in root work. To any crime that the authorities would care about, none of this amounted. Of fevers and mysterious ailments all the time, enslaved people died. As long as the plantation remained productive, and no white people were threatened, in what happened to black workers the law had no interest. What Marcus did not know was that someone else was also investigating Cordelia's activities. Someone with far more resources and far more dangerous intentions. In Charleston, for over a year a man named Victor Kensington had been waiting to hear from Cordelia Rutledge. 52 years old was Kensington, a physician who had been stripped of his medical license in Pennsylvania in 1829 after being accused of conducting unauthorized experiments on patients at the Philadelphia Hospital for the Insane. To Charleston he had fled, where he established himself as a medical consultant, serving wealthy clients interested in alternative treatments and unconventional therapies. In what he called vital transfusion therapy Kensington specialized, based loosely on theories of animal magnetism and life force that had been popular in Europe in the late 1700s. Complex rituals combining bloodletting, hydrotherapy, chemical preparations, and psychological manipulation involved his treatments. That he could transfer youth, health, and vitality from one person to another he claimed, that he had discovered the secret of rejuvenation that alchemists had sought for centuries. Most of his clients were desperate people with money, men facing death from wasting diseases, women terrified of aging, individuals seeking any miracle that medicine could not provide. Exorbitant fees charged Kensington and produced elaborate documentation of his successes, though anyone investigating closely would find that most of his patients either died or disappeared shortly after treatment. In 1836, during a trip to Charleston to visit her family, Cordelia had first encountered Kensington. At a salon hosted by one of Charleston's intellectually curious wealthy widows, she had attended a private lecture he gave about the latest European theories of vital force and the possibility of controlling aging and disease through proper manipulation of the body's inherent energies. Kensington spoke Cordelia, who had been quietly studying medical texts for years, was fascinated. With Kensington at his offices on Church Street, she arranged a private consultation. There, in a room lined with anatomical drawings and jars of preserved specimens, she told him something she had never told anyone else. That her husband had been systematically deceiving her about the paternity of their children she believed. To Kensington, the story Cordelia revealed was complex and dark. Through careful observation and years of suspicion she explained that she had discovered that at least 3 of her 5 children might not be Thomas's biological offspring. Sterile or near sterile she believed Thomas had been, the result of a venereal disease he had contracted in his youth. Rather than admit this shameful secret, without her knowledge or consent Thomas had arranged for other men to impregnate Cordelia. Periodically during their marriage, Thomas had been drugging her, Cordelia claimed, using laudanum and other substances to make her compliant and confused. During these episodes, to her bed other men had been brought. From the plantation, Thomas had selected enslaved men she believed, men who resembled him enough that any children produced would be assumed to be his. The fiction of his virility and ensure the Rutledge line continued this would allow Thomas. Definite proof she had no, Cordelia admitted, but the evidence was persuasive. Her first child, Margaret, looked nothing like Thomas and bore a striking resemblance to certain physical features she had observed in the enslaved population at Willowben. Her second son, Thomas Jr., was darker complexioned than either parent, with hair texture that suggested mixed ancestry. On 3 of her children she had noticed the same crescent-shaped birthmark that she later observed on Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah, 3 men who had all been born at Willowben in the years just before her own children. Whether Cordelia's theory was true or a delusion born of years of unhappy marriage and isolation is impossible to determine with certainty, but absolutely she believed it, and that belief had transformed into an obsession that consumed her completely. Revenge she wanted, she told Kensington. The men who had been used to humiliate her, to violate her without her knowledge or consent, she wanted to destroy. But more than revenge, something else she wanted. To reclaim what had been stolen from her she wanted. Her youth, her vitality, her power she wanted to take back. The damage that years of childbearing and betrayal had inflicted on her body and mind she wanted to reverse. To all of this Kensington listened with the calm attention of a man who had heard many desperate confessions. That what she wanted was possible he told Cordelia, that exactly what she desired his treatments could accomplish. But difficult, lengthy would be the process, and required absolute secrecy and commitment. To Willowben to supervise the treatments himself he could not come, his presence would draw too much attention. Instead, detailed written instructions he would provide, the necessary chemical preparations, and ongoing guidance through correspondence. Substantial would be the cost, $5,000 paid in installments plus the cost of supplies. Immediately Cordelia agreed. From her father, her own money she had, inherited and carefully managed over the years of her marriage. Whatever Kensington asked she would pay. Over the next year, 1836 to 1837, a series of letters from Kensington Cordelia received outlining his treatment protocol. Elaborate and specific were the instructions. 3 male subjects who matched certain physical criteria and who represented the men she believed had violated her she was to select. Through gradual introduction of certain chemical compounds mixed into their food she was to begin preparing them, compounds that would make them suggestible and compliant. Once Thomas died, the full treatment protocol Cordelia could begin, which involved daily ritual bathing, bloodletting, application of various tinctures and preparations, and recitation of specific verbal formulas that Kensington claimed would facilitate the transfer of vital energy from the subjects to herself. A mixture of legitimate medical terminology and complete fabrication were the formulas Kensington provided. From Franz Mesmer's theories of animal magnetism, Samuel Hahnemann's homeopathic principles, and various European occult traditions he borrowed, blending them into something that sounded scientific but was essentially theatrical poison. The chemical preparations he sent included mercury compounds, arsenic solutions, digitalis extracts, and various alkaloids derived from plants. In carefully calibrated doses administered, these substances would gradually destroy the subject's nervous systems while creating the illusion of vital force being drained away. Equally important was the psychological component. To maintain absolute dominance over the subjects, Kensington instructed Cordelia to create an atmosphere of inevitability and helplessness. The nakedness, the cold water, the bloodletting, the incomprehensible verbal formulas, all were designed to break down the subject's sense of self and resistance. The rest would do the regular dosing with chemicals, gradually destroying cognitive function, while Cordelia convinced herself that she was absorbing their youth and vitality. But beyond simply providing Cordelia with her desired revenge, Kensington had another purpose. Everything she reported back to him he was documenting, compiling data for a monograph he planned to write about vital transfusion therapy. Perfect was Cordelia's case. She had access to subjects who could not refuse or report the experiments, she had the intelligence and education to follow complex protocols, and she was motivated by a fanatical belief that made her the ideal collaborator. About what he was asking her to do he had no moral qualms. To Kensington, enslaved people were simply convenient experimental subjects, no different from the asylum patients he had used in Philadelphia. However, one element of the arrangement there was that Kensington had not revealed to Cordelia. With another party he had been corresponding, someone else in Burke County who had their own interest in what was happening at Willow Bend Plantation. A substantial additional fee was being paid to Kensington by this third party for regular reports on Cordelia's activities and state of mind. And for purposes that would destroy Cordelia completely, this same party was preparing to use the information. Oppressive heat to Burke County brought July 1838. Above 90 degrees by mid-morning climbed temperatures and stayed there until sunset. Thick and still hung the air, heavy with moisture from the Savannah River. In the cotton fields, slowly through the rows moved enslaved workers, tending plants that grew lush and green in the wet heat. In the main house at Willow Bend, to the coolest rooms retreated the family and tried to sleep through the worst of the afternoon heat. Despite the weather, without interruption Cordelia continued her dawn rituals. If anything, more intense in her application of Kensington's protocols she became. The dosages of chemicals she administered to Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah she increased. The duration of the creek sessions she extended, sometimes keeping the men in the water for over an hour. New elements to the ritual she added, forced ingestion of bitter tinctures, application of caustic substances to their skin, collection of other bodily fluids beyond blood. Dying were the three men. Anyone with eyes could see it. A yellow, waxy appearance had taken on their skin. Like ghosts they moved, barely present in their own bodies. No longer could Isaiah work at all and spent his days sitting motionless in his cabin. Twice more collapsed Caleb at the forge before Cordelia ordered him confined to quarters. Alone, Josiah continued to function at some minimal level, moving through his duties like an automaton, his eyes completely empty. But finally the evidence he needed to act had found the overseer, Marcus de Quincey. In mid-July, while Cordelia was occupied with visitors from Waynesboro, Marcus entered her bedroom and searched through her belongings. Beneath the floorboard in her closet, he found a locked box. Using a pry bar, he forced it open. Inside were Kensington's letters, dozens of them, outlining the entire treatment protocol in explicit detail. Also there were Cordelia's own journals describing each session at the creek with clinical precision. For chemical purchases from Augusta, there were receipts. And most damning, there was a letter Cordelia had begun but never finished, addressed to Kensington, in which she expressed doubt about whether the treatments were actually working, or whether she was simply murdering 3 innocent men to satisfy her own madness. Several of the most incriminating letters and one of the journals took Marcus. Carefully he replaced the box and left the room exactly as he had found it. Then immediately to Waynesboro he rode to consult with an attorney named Howard Pritchard, a man he knew to be both discreet and ambitious. With growing astonishment, through the documents Marcus had brought read Pritchard. Not just evidence of cruelty to enslaved workers was what Marcus had uncovered, which no court would seriously prosecute, but something far more valuable, evidence that Cordelia Rutledge was mentally unfit to manage her late husband's estate. A woman in the grip of delusion, paranoia, and possibly homicidal mania was revealed by the letters and journals. If properly presented, this evidence could be used to have Cordelia declared legally incompetent, which would necessitate the appointment of a guardian to manage Willowben and its assets. To Marcus, Pritchard explained that several prominent men in Burke County had been waiting for an opportunity to seize control of Willowben. Temporarily in Cordelia's hands had Thomas Rutledge's death left the plantation, but extremely valuable was the property, and there were parties who believed they had legitimate claims to it. With evidence of Cordelia's insanity, these men could petition the court to remove her from control and install a guardian of their choosing. But caution, Pritchard advised. A stronger case they needed to build, gather more witnesses, and time their move carefully. If too quickly they acted, evidence Cordelia might destroy or flee with her children to Charleston. A little longer they needed to let the situation develop, let Cordelia's behavior become even more indefensible, then strike decisively. To wait, Marcus agreed, though he insisted something must be done about the 3 dying men. To arrange for Dr. Pemberton to make an official examination Pritchard promised, which would create documentation of their condition. For the legal case, crucial would this documentation be. What neither Marcus nor Pritchard knew was that already Cordelia had discovered the break-in. Immediately upon returning to her room, she had noticed that the floorboard was slightly displaced. A single scratch on the wood, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, told her that someone had pried up the board. The box she checked and could tell from the arrangement of the letters inside that they had been disturbed. Immediately she knew that it was Marcus. No one else would have had the courage or the reason. Too closely had the overseer been watching her, asking too many questions. A mistake she had made, trusting that her position as plantation mistress would protect her from scrutiny. That white men's loyalty to each other superseded any obligation to women, even wealthy white women, she had forgotten. Swift and ruthless was Cordelia's response. That same evening, to the house she summoned Marcus and dismissed him from his position, effective immediately. The wages owed she paid him and told him to leave Willowben before sunrise. Tried to argue Marcus, but Cordelia's cold fury silenced him. If he attempted to spread lies about her, if he tried to use stolen documents against her, she told him, her family's connections in Charleston she would use to destroy him completely. Never again would she ensure he worked as an overseer anywhere in Georgia or South Carolina. That night Marcus left Willowben, but with him he took the letters and journal he had hidden in his saddlebags. Directly to Howard Pritchard's office in Waynesboro he went, and the 2 men in earnest began preparing their case. An immediate crisis at Willowben created the dismissal of Marcus de Quincey. Quickly Cordelia needed to find a new overseer, as the plantation could not function without someone managing the day-to-day operations of the enslaved workforce. A man named Samuel Gentry, who had been working as a driver, to temporary overseer she promoted. Competent was Gentry, but lacked Marcus's experience and authority. The instability sensed the enslaved population and began to test boundaries, working more slowly, pretending not to hear orders, engaging in small acts of resistance. By increasing punishments and tightening control, Cordelia responded. For minor infractions, she authorized more frequent whippings. Rations she reduced. A strict curfew she imposed and forbade any gatherings after dark. Oppressive and fearful became the atmosphere at Willowben, a pressure cooker of resentment and terror. Meanwhile, without interruption her dawn rituals at Turkey Creek continued. On July 28, 1838, died Isaiah Drummond. Simply during the night he stopped breathing, his body finally giving up after months of chemical poisoning and abuse. Quickly buried in the enslaved cemetery at the edge of the property Cordelia ordered him, with no ceremony or mourning allowed. In the plantation ledger, his death she recorded as fever and consumption, and immediately intensified her treatments of the remaining 2 men, as though Isaiah's death had somehow strengthened rather than discouraged her obsession. In early August, a desperate decision made Margaret Rutledge. No longer could she remain silent while her mother descended into madness and murder. To her maternal aunt in Charleston, Catherine Vance, she wrote a letter describing in careful detail what she had observed at Willowben, her mother's strange behavior, the dawn absences, the deterioration of the 3 enslaved men, Isaiah's recent death, and the pervasive sense that something evil had taken hold of the plantation. Secretly through a trusted house servant Margaret mailed the letter, who was sent to Waynesboro on an errand. 10 days later reached Charleston the letter. Horrified by what she read was Catherine Vance, a widow herself and a woman of considerable social standing. Immediately to Dr. Pemberton she wrote asking him to visit Willow Bend and assess Cordelia's mental state. To the county probate judge she also wrote expressing concern about her niece's welfare and her sister-in-law's fitness to manage the Rutledge estate. These letters, arriving almost simultaneously with the legal maneuverings Howard Pritchard was orchestrating, created a convergence of pressure on Cordelia. By late August, multiple parties were moving against her, though not yet aware of the full extent of the conspiracy was she. On August 20th, Dr. Pemberton visited Willow Bend, ostensibly to check on the family's health. All 5 children he examined and found them reasonably healthy, though young Edmund showed signs of nervous strain. When the doctor asked to examine Caleb Tucker and Josiah Mercer, whose deteriorating conditions had been reported to him, initially Cordelia refused. From ordinary summer fevers the men were suffering she insisted, and that appropriately she was treating them. The issue pressed Dr. Pemberton, and finally Cordelia relented. To the cabin where Caleb lay in a filthy cot, barely conscious, she led him. Extreme emaciation revealed the doctor's examination, signs of heavy metal poisoning including blue-gray discoloration of the gums and fingernails, neurological damage evidenced by tremors and lack of coordination, and what appeared to be chemical burns on the man's shoulders and chest. Shocked was Dr. Pemberton. Of any natural fever, these were not symptoms. Josiah as well he insisted on examining and found similar signs of poisoning and abuse. Directly he confronted Cordelia, asking what treatment she had been administering. Finally cracking her composure, Cordelia told him about the European physician's protocol, about the therapeutic bathing, about the tinctures and preparations designed to cure her own declining health. With growing alarm, Dr. Pemberton listened. Some of the chemicals Cordelia described as extremely toxic he recognized: mercury, arsenic, digitalis in concentrations far beyond therapeutic doses. Bluntly he told Cordelia that she was not curing herself, she was murdering the 2 men. To the county authorities he would be reporting his findings, he said, and that immediately she needed to stop the treatments. Chilling in its calm rationality was Cordelia's response. Over what she did with her own property, he had no authority, she told Dr. Pemberton. For a specific purpose had the 3 men been selected, a purpose the doctor could not possibly understand. In ways that transcended physical assault, they had violated her. In her husband's scheme to humiliate and degrade her, they had participated, knowingly or not. What was happening to them they deserved. And besides, working were the treatments. Stronger, younger, more vital than she had in years she felt. Real was the transfer. Deeply disturbed, Dr. Pemberton left Willow Bend. Directly to the authorities he wrote and filed a formal report with both the county sheriff and the probate court. With the documents Marcus de Quincey had provided to Howard Pritchard, his testimony combined created an overwhelming case against Cordelia. On September 3, 1838, at Willow Bend arrived Sheriff Benjamin Talmadge with a court order. To examination by a panel of physicians was Cordelia Rutledge to submit to determine her mental competence. Pending the results of this examination, a temporary guardian would be appointed to manage the plantation and supervise her children. Under arrest was not Cordelia, but effectively stripped of all authority she was. 3 days later at the courthouse in Waynesboro took place the examination. For over 4 hours, 3 physicians, including Dr. Pemberton, questioned Cordelia. About her beliefs regarding her husband's alleged conspiracy they asked, her understanding of medical science, her reasoning behind the treatments she had administered. Physically and mentally they examined her, looking for signs of hysteria, mania, or delusional thinking. Realizing that everything she had worked toward was collapsing, as rational and composed Cordelia tried to present herself. But when the physicians pressed her on specific details, impossible to hide became her underlying obsession. That her theory about Thomas's deception was based on careful observation and logic she insisted. As scientifically sound she defended Kensington's protocols. That the improvement in her own health proved the treatments were effective she argued. For Isaiah's death she showed no remorse or concern for the suffering of Caleb and Josiah. Unanimous was the panel's conclusion: from severe delusional disorder was Cordelia Rutledge suffering and was mentally incompetent to manage her affairs or care for her children. Immediate intervention and long-term supervision they recommended. As temporary guardian of the Rutledge children and estate, the court appointed Margaret's aunt, Catherine Vance, from Charleston. In mid-September at Willow Bend arrived Catherine with her own household staff and immediately took control. To a locked bedroom in the main house she moved Cordelia, essentially making her a prisoner in her own home. Permanently she ordered the dawn rituals at Turkey Creek stopped. For Caleb and Josiah she arranged for proper medical care, though Dr. Pemberton warned that the damage done to their bodies was likely irreversible. With eerie calm, Cordelia accepted her confinement. Lost she had, that she understood, but wrong she had been she did not believe. In her mind, simply more powerful had the conspiracy against her been than her ability to resist it. From the grave, Thomas had won, even, by ensuring that people would think her mad, rather than believe the truth of what he had done to her. The process of investigating what had actually happened at Willow Bend began Catherine Vance. To track down Victor Kensington in Charleston, she hired investigators. Abandoned they found his offices. His landlord reported that suddenly in early September he had left the city owing several months' rent. His personal effects had been removed, but hidden documents investigators found that revealed the full scope of his fraudulent medical practice and his correspondence with Cordelia. More disturbing was the discovery of letters between Kensington and Howard Pritchard, the attorney who had worked with Marcus de Quincey. That Pritchard had been Kensington's other client, the third party who had been paying for reports on Cordelia's activities, these letters revealed. Deliberately allowing the situation at Willow Bend to deteriorate had been Pritchard, waiting for Cordelia to commit acts so heinous that her removal would be legally unquestionable. As guardian of the estate, to have himself appointed he had been planning, which would have given him control of Willow Bend's substantial assets. When Catherine presented this evidence to the probate court, the conspiracy unraveled. Disbarred was Pritchard and fled Burke County before he could be prosecuted. About everything he had observed, Marcus de Quincey, who had been an unwitting pawn in Pritchard's scheme, provided testimony. That while Cordelia had indeed committed terrible acts, she had also been manipulated by Kensington and allowed to spiral into madness by men who saw profit in her destruction, the court acknowledged. Remained the question, what had Thomas Rutledge actually done? Had he truly orchestrated the complex deception Cordelia believed, or from the start had her theory been pure delusion? A private investigation commissioned Catherine Vance, hiring a former Charleston police detective to examine the question. For weeks spent the detective reviewing Willow Bend's records, interviewing elderly servants, and tracing the histories of Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah. Both more complicated and more tragic than anyone had imagined was what he discovered. In his 20s, Thomas Rutledge had indeed suffered from mumps, an illness that often caused sterility in adult men. From his first marriage, medical records showed that his first wife had never conceived during 8 years of marriage, unusual for a couple with no apparent fertility issues on the wife's side. But drugged Cordelia or arranged for enslaved men to impregnate her against her will Thomas had not. Instead, something far more calculating and cruel he had done. Before his marriage to Cordelia, with enslaved women he had deliberately fathered children he kept at Willow Bend and raised as valuable skilled workers. During the first 2 years of their marriage, when Cordelia failed to conceive, a campaign of psychological manipulation Thomas had begun, suggesting that perhaps the problem was with her, that perhaps she was barren, that perhaps God was punishing her for some sin. Then, after Thomas had started giving her fertility tonics that were actually just harmless herbs, when Cordelia did conceive, her to believe the children were miracles, proof of divine intervention he encouraged. But Cordelia, perceptive and intelligent, between her children and certain enslaved workers had noticed the physical resemblances. Partially correct were the conclusions she had drawn. With Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah did her children share bloodlines, but not because those men had been brought to her bed, because those 3 men were Thomas's children, her children's half-brothers, making her own offspring products of Thomas's earlier relationships with enslaved women. At Willow Bend, Thomas had kept his mixed-race children, given them elevated positions, taught them skills, and even provided small privileges, all while maintaining the fiction that they were simply talented workers. Of secrets and lies, a complex web he had created, never intending for Cordelia to learn the truth. With him, his secrets would die, he had assumed. But Cordelia, through years of observation and suspicion, of the truth a version had pieced together that was close enough to reality to drive her to madness. That her children shared blood with the 3 men she had been correct. That Thomas had deceived her about the fundamental nature of their family she had been correct, but the mechanism of that deception in a way she had constructed that transformed her from victim into perpetrator, from wronged wife into murderer. On September 24, 1838, died Caleb Tucker. To the accumulated poison Cordelia had administered over 6 months, finally succumbing his body. Survived Josiah Mercer but remained in a state of permanent cognitive impairment, unable to work or care for himself. Another 8 years at Willow Bend he lived, cared for by other enslaved workers, a living ghost of what he had been. For murder, never prosecuted, was Cordelia Rutledge. Under Georgia law in 1838, the killing of enslaved people by their owners was not legally considered murder, though as malicious destruction of property it could be prosecuted. The entire situation horrified Catherine Vance, and wanting to protect the Rutledge children from further scandal, arranged for the matter to be handled quietly. In November 1838, to the Georgia Lunatic Asylum in Milledgeville was Cordelia committed. There for 14 years she lived, dying of pneumonia in 1852 at age 57. As a quiet patient who spent her days writing in journals that the staff regularly confiscated and destroyed, hospital records describe her. About Thomas's conspiracy, her belief she never recounted, for the men she had killed, remorse she never expressed, that by Victor Kensington she had been manipulated, she never acknowledged. In Charleston by their Aunt Catherine were the Rutledge children raised. In 1842, Margaret married a physician from Philadelphia and never returned to Georgia. In Virginia, Thomas Jr. attended university and eventually sold Willow Bend in 1856, wanting nothing to do with the plantation where such horror had occurred. The younger children, Catherine, Edmund, and Elizabeth, edited versions of what had happened were told, stories that omitted the worst details of their mother's crimes. Never found was Victor Kensington. In New Orleans in the early 1840s, some reports placed him, still practicing his fraudulent medicine under a different name. To Mexico or South America, others claimed he had fled. Across the American South, dozens of victims he left behind, people he had exploited with false promises of rejuvenation and vitality transfer. By 1850, from all medical directories and city records his name had disappeared, as if he had never existed at all. During the lifetime of anyone involved, never made public was the truth about Thomas Rutledge's secret children. The children he had fathered with enslaved women, except for the 3 Cordelia had murdered, after Catherine Vance took control of the estate, away from Willow Bend were sold. Across Georgia and beyond scattered their descendants, never knowing their connection to the prominent Rutledge family. Until the Civil War, under various owners continued to operate Willow Bend Plantation. In 1864 during the March to the Sea, by Sherman's troops was the main house burned. After the war, to former Confederate soldiers trying to rebuild their lives, the property was subdivided and sold. By 1880, into 6 separate farms had been broken the original plantation, and largely forgotten had been the name Willow Bend, except by the oldest residents of Burke County. Through what was once the Rutledge property, still flows Turkey Creek, clear and cold. But overgrown and avoided by local people became the banks where Cordelia conducted her rituals. In the 1870s and 1880s, in that particular bend of the creek refused to fish or wash clothes freedmen living in the area. Their children they told that the water there was cursed, that it had tasted blood and would never run clean again. By the 1890s, the spot avoided even white farmers, though they could not say exactly why, except that it felt wrong, that heavier there seemed the air, that in the cypress trees along that stretch of water birds did not sing. In 1891, a farmer plowing land that had once been part of Willowben's fields unearthed a wooden box buried about 3 feet deep. Inside were glass bottles with residues of strange chemicals, rusted medical instruments, and water-damaged papers covered in handwriting that had faded to illegibility. Unsettled by the discovery, the farmer reburied the box and never spoke of it to anyone except his wife. When he died in 1903, his diary she burned, which contained a description of the find, saying only that some secrets were meant to stay buried. The most chilling remnant of the Cordelia Rutledge case surfaced in 1899 when a Charleston attorney named Robert Dunwoody was settling the estate of an elderly widow named Catherine Vance, who had died at age 94. Among her personal effects, carefully preserved in a locked trunk, was a collection of letters and documents related to her sister-in-law's crimes at Willowben 60 years earlier. One letter in particular stood out, written by Cordelia to Margaret in 1846 from the asylum in Milledgeville. Only once did Dunwoody read the letter before deciding it should never be made public. Years later to a colleague he described its contents, saying, with such clarity about her own madness the woman wrote, such understanding of what she had done and why, that reading her words was like looking into an abyss. That she had murdered innocent men she knew, that the physician who advised her was a fraud she knew, that on fragments of truth, twisted by paranoia into something monstrous, her theory about her husband's conspiracy was built she knew. But even knowing all of this, even after years of confinement and reflection, that she would have acted differently she could not say. That was the most disturbing thing, not that she was mad, but that she understood her madness and embraced it anyway. Along with most of the other documents from Catherine Vance's trunk, Dunwoody burned Cordelia's letter. Only a few items he kept, receipts from the asylum showing payments for Cordelia's care, a brief account Margaret had written in 1840 describing her mother's final lucid conversation before being committed, and a single page from one of Cordelia's journals, dated March 10, 1838, 1 week after Thomas's death and 3 days into the Creek rituals. The journal entry, which Dunwoody preserved because he believed it was historically significant despite being deeply disturbing, read, "The treatments Dr. H. prescribed I have begun." As expected, the 3 subjects responded to the initial procedures. Nothing I felt during the first session, no transfer of vitality, no sensation of renewal. But today, the 3rd day, something I felt. Perhaps only the cold water shocking my body to wakefulness it was. Perhaps the satisfaction of finally taking action after years of helpless rage. Or perhaps the treatments do work, and what I felt was the beginning of the restoration Dr. H. promised. Certain I cannot yet be. But this I know, I will continue. Too far I have gone to stop now. Even if doubt whispers that I am simply murdering 3 men to feed a delusion, the doubt itself must be crushed. Faith in the treatment is part of the treatment. I must believe. In the Dunwoody family archives remained this single page until 1947, when the attorney's grandson donated it to the Georgia Historical Society along with a brief explanatory note. Catalogued at the society but did not display it or make it available to researchers, judging the content too disturbing and the provenance too questionable. In their restricted collection to this day it remains, available only to scholars who can demonstrate legitimate academic purpose. In Burke County, a cautionary tale whispered among the elderly became the story of Cordelia Rutledge and the rituals at Turkey Creek, a story about the dangers of grief and obsession, about the evil that could flourish in a society built on slavery and absolute power. But with each retelling, details were altered or forgotten. By the 1920s, most people who heard the story assumed it was pure legend, a ghost story invented to frighten children away from dangerous water. The last person who remembered the events firsthand was a woman named Sarah Drummond, born in 1835, who had been Isaiah Drummond's niece. To the remarkable age of 106 she lived, dying in 1941. In her final years, living with her great-granddaughter in Augusta, she would sometimes speak of her uncle Isaiah, the carpenter who had been murdered by the mistress at Willowben. A kind man, talented, and intelligent she described him as, who'd been given no choice but to obey when called to the creek each morning. That toward the end, He had told her that dying was not the worst part, she said. The worst part was forgetting who he was while still being alive, feeling himself disappear piece by piece while his body continued to function. When she spoke of this, Sarah wept even 70 years after his death, saying that some cruelties were so profound they echoed across generations. When Sarah Drummond died in 1941, with her died the last living link to the Willow Bend horror. Across family archives and historical society collections, scattered were the few documents that survived, too fragmentary to tell the complete story. That something terrible had happened at a plantation in Burke County in 1838 would future generations know, that a woman named Cordelia Rutledge had been committed to an asylum for unspecified crimes against enslaved workers, that 3 men had died under mysterious circumstances. But the full scope of the horror, the psychological complexity of the crime, the web of deception and fraud that had enabled it, all of this to time was lost. What remains is Turkey Creek, still flowing through Burke County, its water still cold and clear. Unmarked and unremarkable is the bend where Cordelia conducted her rituals, indistinguishable from 1,000 other places along 1,000 other southern creeks. But the water remembers, the land remembers. And in the memories of descendants who still live in Georgia, scattered fragments of the story persist, distorted by time, but never quite disappearing, like bloodstains that no amount of scrubbing can fully erase. This mystery shows us how easily desperation and betrayal can transform a person into something unrecognizable, how the systems of power and oppression in the Old South created conditions where such horrors could occur with minimal legal consequence, the darkest aspects of a society built on slavery it reveals, where human beings could be tortured and killed with almost no accountability, where women's rage and trauma could find expression only in violence against those even more powerless than themselves, where medical charlatans preyed on the desperate and vulnerable, and where family secrets could poison multiple generations. What do you think of this story? A victim driven to madness do you believe Cordelia was, or a murderer who used her circumstances as justification? Could anyone have stopped what happened at Turkey Creek before it was too late? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.